Welcome back to Reform Millennials, a podcast where we discuss the intersection of markets, politics, and pop culture. Please remember that the content of this show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial or tax advice. Please consult a professional before you make any investment decisions.
Morning, Joel. How's it going? Or is it morning where you are?
It is not. It's 5 o'clock, 5:15.
5 o'clock somewhere.
That's right. I'm not going to say that I'm having anything to drink here, but I'm about to. We have we're at welcome. It's a welcome dinner to the wedding that we're in Italy for. So
Just pure dedication to the pod. Recording before you go into a welcome drinks dinner in Italy. Like, who loves the market more than you, honestly?
almost nobody. But I would say that my wife, on our drive up here, she was like prepping me for this. This is her friend group from school, and she said, "Joel, no talking about politics at dinner." And I said,
Yeah.
"Well, perfect. I have to record this podcast prior, so I'll get it all out before I go and chat with your med school friends." So
Yeah.
we're here. I'm going to kind of get everything off of my chest so that I can talk about the healthcare system for 4 days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good crew
Right.
she has too. Lots of smart, awesome, talented people. But yeah, it is. I mean, before we get into it, it's interesting that you say that, because I feel like we almost have to get ourselves in that mindset lately, because sometimes it is hard to get into a group of people and chat about different opinions. But I feel like there are some groups where you can do that. I'm sure that's the group that you're into. But yeah, don't
They'll
get
be
into any
fine.
rogue opinions.
Everybody here is from Toronto, so I will be the lone Western Canadian, and I've come prepared just in case they come at me with anything. But I it's a very the group is lovely, so I don't think we're gonna have too much of an issue.
Yeah, they
But
really are.
but yeah, I'm excited to chat. Anyways, it's been again 2 weeks. It feels like it's been a in that period of time. It feels as though 5 years happens in 2 weeks.
Yep.
And I was doing a little bit of on these trips with family and stuff, and I'm sitting out. I finally get the kids down, and you start to like just think about stuff. But you're away from work, but you're in a way. I'm thinking about what I actually do for a living.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, what do I actually do? And it's like, sure, it's finance and portfolio. I manage portfolios, and I work for families, but it really comes down to one little thing. And I've been reading a few books, and it's storytelling. I talk about
Mhm.
and tell stories about markets, the economy, technology. It's all one big story. My thought process on how I view investing, how I view opportunity, whether it be politically, entrepreneurially, or in investing, it's all tied to like this meta framework and storytelling that I provide for myself and for the people that I work for and work with. And I think what's important is that you can, in my role, do a good job of helping people understand where we're coming from a humanity perspective, and where we're headed, because it enables them to take risks perhaps they might have been unwilling to take in otherwise. If I'm unable to help them understand why and where we're going, they're much more unlikely to take the risk necessary to achieve the returns that they're wanting to obtain. And I have to go through, and you notice this in the notes that we provide on Notion before we go live. It's like I just throw endless stuff in there, and it's really just me telling a story or crafting ideas that helps me understand the current moment that we're in. And I know that you do the same, but you're less likely to share it with me, whereas I just throw it all in the open. And recently, I think that this market specifically has really taken a life of its own. And in tech, there's this rule where you have like a 99-1 rule, where you have 90% of people that consume content, you have 9% of people that will engage a little bit more. And I think this is incredibly true on Twitter. And then 1% are consumers, or rather content creators. These creators are providing the lion's share of the things that we consume. And in the past, we've seen new technological advancements that have taken advantage of this. They've created tools for those in the 9% that want to become the 1%. And it has enabled people to become new stars of and relevant influencers. We have this new craft and this new profession that was created 15, 20 years ago and has taken a life of its own, where we have influencers like Mr. Beast that are bigger than movie stars. They're bigger
Mhm.
than athletes. And what's happened is in markets and in technology specifically, the companies that have enabled this ascension of regular folks into superstardom, these technologies have actually been the most impactful of any, and has created the best returns for investors. Now, those tools, if you were to just like think about them, have been Google, most specifically, the tools that they've provided, whether it be YouTube and the aggregation platform that they've put together. Google, specifically, the search engine that enables people that are writing to be found no matter where. And before, you used to have to write for a magazine or for a newspaper, but now you can just post something on a blog and it is then put together by Google. You have Meta, and that has Facebook and Instagram that enables people to live stream just like we are today. And it enables us to put out ideas without having somebody who is platforming us. And these tools have ascended into superstardom, where they're now worth $2 trillion to $3 trillion. 3 trillion being the entire market cap of the Canadian publicly traded stocks. That is an enormous number. And moving forward, and what's very interesting, and what has really caught my eye over the last, call it, 30 days, has been OpenAI's ascension to this new role, where they're now trying to become the Microsoft of artificial intelligence. And
Mhm.
they've just recently, a couple days ago, started releasing Sora, which is effectively a tool that allows the 90% to become creators. And this Sora tool puts, if you're able to craft an idea, it is able to make it into a video effectively. And it's quite shocking how good it is. And this release, along with a whole host of other news releases from OpenAI, and I'm happy to list 10 of them right now, but whether it be the 10% deal with AMD, the 10% deal with NVIDIA in terms of their investment into OpenAI, their commitment or capital commitment to Oracle, this huge ecosystem of artificial intelligence is largely attached to the storytelling that is being provided by Sam Altman, who has been able to craft a meaningful, we'll call it, story of releases that has pushed our stock market to all-time highs. And the market itself doesn't seem to want to slow down. Currently, there's many investors. I mean, Paul Tudor Jones just recently, who's one of the most notorious hedge fund managers in America, has recently come out to say that we're in a bubble. There's no shortage of handsomely rich investors that are starting to call BS on the capex from these large companies and smaller. But what's interesting is that this story just continues to develop, and folks continue to remain very bullish on U.S. large cap stocks. They have gotten to the point where they're almost outperforming Germany, which was largely leading the developed world over the last, call it, 9 to 12 months. The tariff tantrum of just 5 months ago or 6 months ago is long forgotten. It is an incredible exercise in storytelling. And whether or not AI progress is going to hit a wall is impossible for me to know. But the real risk in this bubble popping, to me, is going to be not necessarily a failure of the technology necessarily, but I actually think it's Sam Altman and the large tech CEOs that are investing in not just him, but Anthropic and many of the other LLMs and chat companies, or we'll call it AGI businesses. It's their inability to develop a storyline that people continue to buy into. So to me, the where I started today might seem silly, in that I'm attaching some ridiculous idea of storytelling to trillions of dollars in market cap. But I actually think that this is what ends up stopping the, or throwing the proverbial stick into the spokes of the AI bicycle. And if they can continue to tell a meaningful story and have incredible results with regards to AI model releases and a step function improvement of return on on capital, I don't see this as a bubble that is anywhere near its end. And on my flight over to this to Italy from Lisbon today, I was listening to the most recent podcast on Invest Like the Best. They had Dylan Patel on
Mm.
from Fabricated Knowledge and Semi Analysis, and he is one of the preeminent writers and analysts on the AI cycle. And his conversation with Patrick O'Shaughnessy for 2 hours is a must listen for anybody. It is exactly where we're headed, and he really clears up a lot of this current environment for those that maybe think it's beyond them. I think that that'd be a really great place for them to strap in and learn a little bit. So anyway, Mel, back to where are we with the market? The index continues to make new highs, whether that be Canada or the United States and overseas. Gold continues to rally. It's up another 10% in September. It's been an amazing year. European equities have outperformed. It's been quite shocking, but I think outside of the AI story, the secondary, and probably the most important item that I think people should be paying attention to is gold prices. It's quite clear that the U.S. hegemony as a dollar-dominated economy is becoming less and less relevant due to the prominence and the investment in gold, and to a lesser extent Bitcoin. And I think it's increasingly important to understand that sovereign entities outside of the United States and our major, and the US's major trading partners, are buying gobs and gobs of gold reserves, and they are shifting their strategy from owning US dollars to owning gold, not necessarily in entirety, but as a portfolio hedge. And they're hedging their exposures back to, especially large asset managers and pension funds and endowments. They're hedging their exposure back to their specific currency rather than owning US dollars. And that is a step function change. And until there's some sort of clarity from Washington and the Trump administration, it's very unlikely that this is going to reverse. So I think that there's two things contributing to this, and it's one, uncertainty with tariffs, and two, continued deficits from all the major economies across the planet.
Yep.
So long as those things continue to happen, gold prices are likely going to continue up and to the right. Not financial advice. So Mel, I think that sort of dovetails well into your number one topic, which is it sounds like Carney's going to finally chat with Donnie T.
Again. Okay, before we move on to that, though, I just want to comment, because I know that when you started the podcast, you're like, oh, it's a little unconventional to talk about storytelling. But it's really funny that you mentioned that, because there's a book called The 7 Basic Plots. I don't know if you've ever read it.
I have not.
Okay, well, it's a good book. It's quite a thick book. It's called The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories. It was published in 2004. It's by a guy named Christopher Booker. And I actually teach this when I'm teaching people how to lobby and how to negotiate, because you're talking about it in the context of storytelling being important for people to understand markets. I think as much as it is important to learn how to tell stories, to communicate, it's important to contextualize where you may be in a certain story as well, when you're negotiating, when you're lobbying, when you're looking at the market as well. So I think that that's actually not a bad way to look at things, because one thing that I'm always cognizant of in my sphere, and I think it applies to finance as well, is human nature. Human beings are different. As you say, technology is different, the conditions are different, but the way in which human beings react and respond to stimuli tends to be the same. And so I actually do think that it's instructive to look at storytelling, both from a way of communicating from that content creation perspective, but sometimes when I'm in a tough negotiation or in a tough spot, I try to think of like what the plot line is for me or my client or whatever I'm dealing with, and what the plot line for the person opposite or the party opposite is thinking as well. And it's a good way to negotiate as much as it is to understand markets and politics. So I actually don't think that's a silly thing that you brought up. I think it's really important. And I think that people don't respond to facts. People respond to stories and the sort of emotional pull that stories have. So I actually think it's a really good point, and we could probably talk about that more too another time, but wanted to just make sure I said that before we moved on to
whenever
U.S. Canada.
Yeah, whenever the news story slows down, let's have a conversation about storytelling. And I find that the best salespeople, the people that can resonate and attach, well, people that can resonate with others quickly, largely are their greatest asset is their ability to relate to them quickly, but then notice areas in which they're interested, and then pinpoint that and tell a story that brings them in. And
Hmm.
um, that is an art, something that you not always born with, but it certainly is something that you can train into your conversation style and how you read rooms and situations. And I think you made a really good point. I'm gonna have to. I wrote that book down, so I'll
It's
be checking
very
that out.
thick. Like I've not ever read it cover to cover. I read excerpts of it because it's literally like this thick, but it's a
Oh
good
my
one to go into.
gosh. Okay, I'll check it out. Awesome.
But it's a good pivot into the U.S. Canada stuff. So in about 10 minutes, Carney is scheduled to be in the Oval Office meeting with President Trump. This will be the second time that he's been to Washington. Carney's been to Washington and had a White House meeting, and so like they've met a few other times before, notably when Canada hosted the G7 in Kananaskis earlier this spring. And sounds like this meeting came out of a sort of informal exchange that they had at the UN General Assembly last month. And the way in which Trump conducts foreign policy at times is like, hey, why don't you stop by? So I think that's what this visit is all about. But it's timely, I think, because I think we talked about this a few episodes ago from the political perspective and how much the tariff regime or the tariff realities have changed over the past few months, thinking of where we were in March when we were in the middle of the federal or entering the federal election rather, and the tariffs that Trudeau and subsequently Carney had put on the United States to where we are now. So the tariffs that currently exist as of September 1st on the US are primarily concentrated on steel, aluminum, and auto imports at that 25% mark. Carney has removed most of the other retaliatory tariffs that they elbows up earlier this year. So for anybody thinking that, those elbows are still up, they're not. That's the right move for Carney. I'm fully supportive of that. I think that's the right move. It's just a little bit different than what he campaigned on. And the big discussion point, I think, or I guess the things that have changed or what I anticipate will have changed as part of this discussion is the fact that Trump is starting, this is kind of a juxtaposition to what you're saying about the large cap stocks and the performance of the stock market. But President Trump is no doubt starting to feel the pressure from American companies that are feeling what the tariff uncertainty, feeling the negative effects of the tariff uncertainty. And there's been some recent polling from the US that suggests that many believe that the economy is headed in the wrong direction. And so I think we're always talking about the sort of two aspects. We're talking about the economy and the market. And as we've
And they are not the
discussed,
same thing.
they're not the same. And they often don't follow the same sort of trends. So, and that is actually quite interesting because we know from President Trump, or we can infer from President Trump that he looks to the stock market as his barometer of success. And stock market up, good day. Stock market down, bad day. And while that may be an appropriate way to look at performance if you're an asset manager or somebody in the private sector that's worried about, that's really not the whole story. So I think the thing that's going to be different about this meeting when they start meeting in the next 5 to 10 minutes is that Trump may be slightly more aware of the fact that it's not such a great idea to be in an argument with Canada. But I don't know that Canada today is showing up to that meeting with much more leverage than they had previously, because I don't know how much stock, no pun intended, I don't know how much stock Trump puts in polling numbers of the American public feeling the economy is headed in the wrong direction. He still has another year until midterm elections are going to perhaps impact people in the GOP and the political pressure he may feel internally. But I don't know that much has necessarily changed since they met last time. I think it's a good thing that Carney's meeting with Trump. It's a good thing that they have a relationship. Trump certainly seems to have a better relationship with Carney than he did with Trudeau and Freeland. So that's good. But I'm curious to see what actually comes out of this and whether or not Trump actually hits Carney with some of the other foreign policy topics we got into a couple of weeks ago as well. So it's sort of like a close notes. I don't know if you have any questions about that directly, but we'll see what happens.
No, I think what I would do is add to it, and in addition to your comments regarding the economy not being the stock market, there is a K-shaped structure to the current market where we have a portion that is largely outperforming the other. I would say 7 or 8 companies are dragging the stock market up while the rest of the market is not participating, so to speak. Now, while that is not 100% true, there are plenty of companies that are participating. The lion's share of the market cap appreciation is finding itself inside of the Nasdaq 100, and that in of itself is a poor representation of the overall economy. And if you were to look at the core PCE, which has started to tick back up in the United States, if you were to look at unemployment expectations, if you were to look at consumer confidence, and all three of those numbers, inflation ticking back up with the most recent number of 2.9% in the United States, you have retail sales that are on fire, but that it's barely outpacing inflation. You have a consumer confidence number sub 65, which the average is usually right around 80. The reality is that the average American feels that they are not receiving the same sort of bump that is being felt by capital owners in the United States. People that are
Hmm.
asset owners and capital deployers and folks that have made it have and continue to see major appreciation in net worth, whereas folks in the center and perhaps the have-nots are not receiving that support that they felt like they were going to receive when Donald Trump was gained office. So that puts him in this odd, precarious situation. And I think that it's very difficult for folks to look at this information in a partisan way. It's for the most part, when you start to address market, or I should say political dogmas, whichever side you believe that you're on, you're going to think that the economy is doing really well or really poor. I think it's never been more shocking for me than to see how people perceive the economy to be doing when their party's in power versus when it's not in power. When you see it, literally just shifts completely based on who's currently running the country. And I think that eliminates basically any sort of polling data that asks folks how they view the economy. However, when you start to look at consumer confidence and you start to see large changes in that, not because of who's in office, but just because of where exactly we sit in the economy, and it starts to shift away from where the market's headed, I think that tells a unique story. And you were making this point that the midterms are en route and it's in 2026. It's going to be an incredibly important thing for him. He's, I think, losing some steam with a good portion of his base in that his tariffs have not resulted in the, we'll call it, center of America economic boom that I believe he was voted in on. If anything, it's actually quite the opposite of what has occurred. And
Hmm.
I'm not the person who attaches economic outcomes as tightly to politicians as some people do. I believe that the economy will do what the economy does. While I also believe policy and how you craft that policy is really important. And right now, I believe if you were to ask the average, we'll call it, of 2,000 Republican voters in, we'll call it, flyover states, I'm not so certain they'd be as bullish as the folks that are in Texas and in Florida. So I think you point out some important things. I'm of the opinion that waiting to get any sort of negotiation done with the United States is likely going to turn out to be a benefit to Carney, largely because of how this has shaken out
Yeah,
and just how dependent we each of our nations are on one another.
correct.
And I think that people that vote on this, that don't actually have a vote, but a vote with their dollars, are noticing this. And you can see it. The Canadian stock market has done incredibly well. And I'm I believe that there's a lot of upside on the back half of a Trump administration with Carney, more so than where we were 3 years ago or 2 years ago.
Mhm.
So I'm interested to see how this plays out. I'll be paying attention to your comments in post 20 minutes.
Yeah, and I think that also it is though important to be mindful of the fact that, or I guess I would seek your confirmation on this because I'm not the financial expert, but we can't compare Canada and the United States, I don't think, in the same way, because as you said, like those 7 or 8 companies that are really on the NASDAQ 100 that are really driving change. We don't have that kind of bench strength in Canada
Oh,
with our companies, or the companies that are large here in Canada. And I know I keep on repeating myself about this, but I think it's very important. Our GDP is largely driven by housing valuation. And so I just think it's
mhm.
really important that just because that's been the impact in the United States doesn't mean it's going to be the impact in Canada,
Agreed.
and doesn't mean that we're going to respond to it in the same way. And when you mention, would now be a good time to talk about the budget changes before we dive into
I'd
talking
love to
about.
hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason why this is important is because Canada has definitely been in what I would consider not a great spot when it comes to our fiscal house. There's some controversy that there's a role for it's a basically an arm's length organization. It's a parliamentary office in Canada. It's called the Parliamentary Budget Office, PBO. There's an interim parliamentary budget officer right now who is appearing before committee a couple of weeks ago in Canada, who was, I don't want to be dramatic and say he was sounding the alarm on Canada's finances, but he was definitely cautioning that Canada is not currently headed in the right direction when it comes to how we are managing our public debt and deficits, and that we are really not well positioned to pay that off anytime soon. And I think, as you mentioned, we see in the United States, of course, in Canada, this is different because Canada, the Canadian dollar is not a reserve currency in the way that the US is. But we can see that is not an insignificant thing that the markets just forget to notice. I also think it has a big influence on state capacity. We see the next federal budget in Canada will be on November 4th. I'll get into some of the procedural changes there, but you're going to see cuts in operational spending. And so I'm going to loop this back. You were talking about the fact that people see the economy very differently based on the partisan affiliation sometimes that they are
Mhm.
part of. I would say a primary driver that divides partisan opinions from left and right in Canada, at least, on the economy would be belief of the left versus right on how money and prosperity is created. I think that the left believes that prosperity is created, if like thinking back to like my money and banking economics class, like money is created when banks are able to, or people are able to access private capital, leverage that capital to create value and grow the economy, essentially. And I think that the right believes a little bit more in the importance of unlocking that capital and that economic movement and innovation when it comes to that. And I think that the left believes a little bit more that there's a more active role that the state should play in that value creation process. And the reason why that's important is that if you are somebody who believes more progressively that the state should have a more active role in growing and investing in the economy, then you should be concerned about the fact that the investments that we're going to see from Canada in the November 4th budget 2025, and in the following budgets are going to significantly draw back on operational spending in favor of capital investments. We'll talk about a few of those later on. So if you're a person who was thinking that a lot of the public programs, like operational spending is anything that's like a payment from government, or like a program spending or grant streams. Capital is anything that the government invests in to build. So it's usually structures or infrastructure of some kind. And people who are familiar with accounting will note how these are tagged differently. But if you should be concerned, I think, that the government is not going to be at the table for as active of a role on operational spending in Canada, because Carney at least does see that debts cannot go on forever. the thing I wanted to say about that was we saw this week, yesterday, that the government released they're going to be approaching how they budget a little bit differently. There's 2 points that they've made. One of them we already knew. Carney and his government plan to separate the capital and operational budgets, I think from like more of a marketing perspective, and how they sort of roll those out to Canadians, because they're always separated in a budget, with a goal of balancing the operational budget and making investments on the capital side. So we are going to see cuts to operations from that perspective. The second thing we heard yesterday was that the government intends to table legislation, or sorry, not table legislation, to present its budget. So it's essentially like the marketing plan, like not the actual legislative mechanism of budgets, in the fall versus in the spring, so that industry and Canadians have a sense of what they can expect to see coming in the next fiscal year with a little bit more lead time. So those are 2 changes that came from this week. So I've been saying for the past few weeks that I don't know that we're going to see that much of what to expect in fiscal 26-27 in that November 4th budget, but we actually might if they decide to sort of institute some of these things more immediately. So budget 2025 being tabled on November 4th, in my books, just became a little bit more important on a forward-looking basis than it was previously. So I'll stop there, but it's an interesting change in terms of how they're hoping to give and signal that clarity, I think. So, from like a market perspective, we'll have probably a better sense this fall of where Canada is going to put its investment, which may help their case and their efforts, even with negotiating with the U.S.
I mean, you make a lot of really interesting points, because I find that I think you're accurate in the way in which you define the 2 sides of the aisle in terms of their view of, we'll call it, capital expenditures from the government and how they're deploying their tax money. And I think much of the rights issue with how Canada has deployed and crafted policy in that deployment has been, they either, 1, chose winners, or 2, spent it on social programs rather than infrastructure and for export, and or we'll call it innovation and infrastructure. And interestingly, I think that this most recent shift, I think, in 1, a technological paradigm, 2, political shift that we've seen, and I think 3, the change in who is actually representing the Liberal Party in Canada, has uniquely enabled us to, I think, make a change in the way in which we handle our finances. And it'll be interesting to see on November 4th and the preceding days following what that budget looks like. I know that their capital plans are some people in Alberta are happy, some aren't. I think that they're a step in the right direction. However, and you noted this in our notes, the Enbridge CEO, Greg Ebel, delivered a speech at the Empire Club. And what was this, like 3 or 4 days ago, maybe 5 days ago? And he effectively was issuing an urgent message to businesses in Canada that Canada must rebuild or risk being left behind. And in his comments, he also notably addressed how we missed a lot of the infrastructure opportunity of 15, 20 years ago, and that we can't afford to miss a second chance. Rarely do you get a second chance at a paradigm shifting CapEx deployment opportunity. But I think uniquely, this one is bigger and badder and more intense, and likely going to have better return. And this is something that I'm going to be writing a lot about in the coming, call it, year and a half, I think. But if you are not understanding the impact of AI, but then also the current 2 bottlenecks that is withholding us from seeing, call it, a large language model released that is more impactful than GPT-5 and Gemini 3 at faster paces, it is largely a result of 2 things. Latency. So I think a lot of people have probably had or grew up with dial-up and then having incrementally better fiber delivered to their house so that they can stream more, right? I remember back in the day when you used to go do 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 when you were signing into the
Couldn't
internet
use
on
the
your
phone
computer.
while using the
Couldn't
internet.
exactly.
That was a simpler time. I mean, can we just in many ways, it would be nice to be back there, just emotionally,
I know, but now
Go ahead.
I'm sitting at this like farm in the middle of Italy, and I'm able to talk to you, and you're on the
Yeah,
other
we
side
would
of
not be
the
doing
world.
any of that. Yeah.
Absolutely not. So interestingly, our houses have now enabled us everywhere in the world to put near anything. However, in order to have a cloud-based large language model that delivers you the world's information, it requires a low latency. Now, that's more of a networking issue and more of a hardware problem. The second biggest issue is one, you can stand up a data center if you're just racking GPUs and networking infrastructure in days, weeks. However, the big problem right now is the bottleneck in power, energy,
Yep.
something that Alberta and Canada has endless amounts of. And the interesting thing is that these power plants, these generators, turbines, all take a year to 3 years to stand up and right next door to those data centers that are going to provide us the compute that is going to enable us to train the models, to then serve the models and provide us with artificial general intelligence. And I think when Greg Abel is making this point, he is talking about this demand. Right now, they have a $20 billion capex budget at maybe it's 20 or 30 billion for Enbridge. I'm forgetting the number, but 2/3 of that is going to the United States. The other 1/3 of that capex is mostly just maintaining and slightly, and we'll call it expanding a few things in Canada. Most of that is that's maintenance capex. That is telling a story.
Yep.
The largest pipeline utility in the country, and not just our country, also nearly the largest utility in the United States, is telling us that there's no business case and opportunity in Canada because of issues politically.
Yes. And
They
you
can't
make
get anything done. He made 3 comments on 3, I believe, like 3 different bills
yes.
or
So
pieces of legislation.
this is a great point, Joel, and you beat me to it. I talked about how the Carney government is going to start investing in capital, which they should, by the way. But it's important to note that we need capital deployment from the government in their lane when it comes to public infrastructure, roads, bridges, universities, hospitals. That's more of a provincial thing. Education. We absolutely need the deployment of capital from the public sector and with taxpayer dollars. But we also need the policies in place to encourage deployment of capital and investment in infrastructure from the private side of things. And a couple of sort of sticking points when it comes to this is C-48, which is the tanker ban off the coast of British Columbia, C-69, which is the regulatory process, and then more related to the data center play is net zero electricity regulations that the federal government has imposed. So, I mean,
All 3 of these things need to get ratified if we expect to take part in this new paradigm shift. Straight up, end of story.
And I will tell you
my
that I do not believe that is going to happen under this government. I believe that the Liberal government will do absolutely better than the Trudeau government did, that they will absolutely create more reason for optimism. But we're talking about some pretty cornerstone pieces of legislation. Minister Hodgson, our Minister of Energy, former Goldman Sachs, worked with Carney there. Really smart guy. I think we're very lucky to have him in that chair, dodging questions about whether they're going to do anything about C-48, the tanker ban. We see that they've paused the EV mandate as of right now, but we don't know. That's just for a year. We don't know what's going to happen with that. So the trap that Canada will fall into is, yes, there's the signal and the noise. You can send the signal to the market that you're going to be more accommodating and encouraging of capital. But if you do not do the things through state capacity that are required to actually make that so and remove the certainty, then you're not going to experience that. You may experience peaks of it, but you're not going to see it in a sustained way. So there is a policy role for the government to play privately.
Couldn't agree more. Those two specifically that you mentioned are my least worrisome. Tanker ban, whatever. We'll move north. The carbon cap is a problem because that is quite directly a cap on innovation. It is a
Mhm.
cap on, and this is one of the tightest things in economics and in markets, that our efficiency as a human group is tied so tightly to the amount of energy demand that we are generating as a group, that without appreciation or and draw an increase in energy consumption, it's unlikely that we see any market appreciation. And for those that are investing in the future and taking advantage of what is currently happening, they will move to areas in which don't have carbon caps, because that will be where they develop the technology, stand up these generators, stand up these data centers, and they will serve us our AI slop to us in North America, in Canada, while it's being produced in Texas.
It's an
If
important
we want,
distinction too.
it is. And I think people need to revisit what a carbon cap means. I'm not suggesting that that climate change isn't real or that it's not something we should be concerned about. However, I do think that tax revenue pays for the nice things that we have, and it pays for our schooling, our hospitals, our infrastructure. It enables us to continue to expand our standard of living. It enables us to immigrate, and it enables us to have the ability to take in refugees, to take care of the rest of the world. We do that with money generated by the companies taking advantage and building the future. And if we do not craft a story which enables our, our founders, our entrepreneurs, our business leaders to deliver to the market what we can provide because of a view on carbon that doesn't coincide with with technological advancement, we are going to miss the opportunity. There is a business case. Our major CEOs are saying, business case, ding, 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 get out of our way. So I think that this is one of the issues specifically that needs to be addressed, is that cap, because just recently there is a kind of little tidbit in the logic where that released Meta, Pembina near deal to build massive Alberta AI data center. Now, the word massive is a little bit tongue in cheek here. This is not big on a global scale, but it's big for Alberta.
Mhm.
And I think that this uniquely points out the opportunity here. There are multi-year backlogs of turbines from GE and from a whole host of companies that build infrastructure for these mega data centers. And what we are able to do in Canada is provide a ton of liquid oil, and we oftentimes blow off gas. Interestingly, if we were to reutilize that and put these data centers next to areas in which we are literally burning gas that we do not need, I think we have this beautiful situation where we have a similar economic location and belief. We have the rule of law. We have a whole bunch of things that these mega, not only that, cheaper labor than the United States, all of these things that are uniquely beneficial to Canada because of our location relative to the United States, where we can benefit from investments like these that Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg is making in the facilities near Fort Saskatchewan. That is a signal, and we should be considering that, because we have an amazing opportunity here. And I'd love for to see some form of change. Now, I don't know if there's something that can be done at the provincial level in order to ignore carbon caps, but I do know that this is, to me, of the three, the number one that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so you're talking about two different things, on the emissions cap side of things, and then as well on the net zero electricity grid timing.
That
So it's
one's
two separate.
that one feels a little less meh. I'm much more
Well,
concerned about, oh, you can't, because you set up a gas plant that gets added to the emissions level, right? And then we export that data to other countries, similarly to how China is the largest consumer of energy in the world. and then they export all of these goods, right? Like we've effectively moved all manufacturing to China and India, and that is us effectively exporting our carbon emissions, right? Go ahead. I know that you
But
have a...
the reason why that's an important distinction is that Alberta is not in the same spot as other provinces. Alberta's electricity grid is majority run by natural gas. And so if you want to be net zero just from like the normal usage of electricity that we have just as consumers, and you want to add data center capacity on top of that, depending on how those data centers are going to be powered, if they're going to be powered by nat gas or other sources of energy, it's an important consideration, because the more demand that you are putting on the electricity grid, the more of a burden on the net zero aspect of it, right? And so the source of that energy, if it's going to be nat gas, that's not going to be compatible with the timelines that the federal government have imposed on the net zero timeline, because technology is growing and getting to a better place where we can achieve those things, but we have a much longer way to go on that transition period than other provinces do who have greater hydro power or, you know, nuclear or else. So that's just, and Alberta has transitioned away from coal beginning in 2015. So that's a good thing. But I mean, natural gas is still more emissions intensive than like wind or hydro or solar. So it's just an important distinction to make, that those, maybe this is a good place to segue before we finish off into the idea of the West Coast pipeline application that Smith wants to put forward. First of all, what do you think about it? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I want to add one thing to the grid situation. Now, the grid is not all dependent upon itself. There are separate sections, right? So, interestingly, these data centers, depending on the size, so now the ones that they're looking at attaching to our grid in, we'll call it north of Edmonton, those would be, as you stated, attached to or a impact on our grid in terms of draw. It would impact the cities surrounding. However, dependent on size, if you're standing up call it a 500 megawatt to a 1 gigawatt data center, that in itself would likely be sufficient to have its own nuclear power source, to have its own, we'll call it solar farm and gas plant, where it would be completely within its own circuit. And that is where we're headed in terms of CapEx size, as just to attach a number for folks that don't quite understand the impact of this. In order to stand up a data center that is, call it a gigawatt, it's 50 billion in CapEx. 50 billion. That is the entire market cap of Suncor, or we'll call it 70% of it. That is an enormous sum of money. That is like, what's the projected cost of the LRT in Edmonton? 3.5 billion.
Yeah, probably somewhere between 3 and 5 billion.
So it's about 15 to 16 times the size of that, and they're setting these things up in less than a year. So to think that this would be impactful is an understatement. The opportunity here is unbelievable. So I hope that those numbers maybe resonate a little bit, and I do want to transition to this, and I'd like to hear.
Okay, wait, I need to make one more point. Sorry, I know, but it is important to note that Alberta's electricity grid generation is powered solely by private investment, and this is not the same as in other parts of Canada. So this is why, coming full circle on the Hodgson thing, you need to incentivize, especially in electricity, private companies to invest in generation projects to complement that, because Alberta it's not the government making a decision on the generation. The government functions with the regulatory perspective on that, but you need private company Joel to want to invest millions of dollars in building that additional supply that is also net zero, that also has to go through Bill C-69 in terms of environmental regulatory review. So this is how we tie all these things together. Anyway, sorry.
I totally agree. That's a really good point, actually. That ties it all, puts a nice bow on it.
Yeah.
So go back to where you're at with regards to Western pipeline.
I think the thing that is interesting about this, and I want to sort of see how things go, there's more politics to this than there's lots of policy to this. It's a huge proposed project. But I think what Smith is doing with this is saying, your move, Carney. because Carney has opened up this major projects office based in Calgary. The first 5 projects that were released did not include a pipeline, but he is basically arguing that things are going to be different, et cetera, because of the way that the regulatory works. The fact that like having a private proponent solely on this doesn't quite work, but the fact that the government is now saying that they're going to be a proponent for this proposed project, they're going to invest $14 million to support early planning work, and they are going to submit an application to the Major Projects Office in spring of 2026. You've got Southbow, Enbridge, and Trans Mountain participating in this as 3 companies in the technical advisory group. Basically, what needs to happen is that Carney, from a political perspective, needs to be willing to deploy political capital to make this happen. And he essentially needs to, like, we have David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, saying that this is not something that they want. The Indigenous groups don't want this. This is going to be, I think, the first real national unity and economic test for Carney of whether he cares more about not rocking the boat or whether he puts his neck out and says, I understand your concerns and I thank you for them, but we are building this pipeline. And I'm going to use Bill C5 and the Major Projects Office to make sure that that happens, because C5, remember, empowers the federal government to override certain regulatory and expedite things. So this was actually a very brilliant political move by Danielle Smith to basically say, you say things are different. Are they? Let's see. And so that's why I think it's very important politically. You can talk till the cows come home about like whether there's a business case for it, whether there's whatever. I actually don't even think it's, I mean, I would obviously
I
like
don't care
this to
there
be
is
built,
one. Like, it doesn't matter.
but like it is a test. It is a test, and how Carney and his government respond to it, and whether or not Carney thinks that he can stand up to the political pressure that exists within his party and within his cabinet. How far can he stretch that, and how much different is he going to be? Because we can say that we're different on many different metrics, but there are tests and there are moments that define whether or not you are or not. So that's what I'd like to say when it comes to this proposed pipeline. I think that's the most important thing about this pipeline. I don't think the technicalities of it, I don't think the economics of it, like I think that is the thing that I'm going to be watching about how Carney responds. And just a last thing on this, it does seem like Smith and Carney are getting along much better than Trudeau and Carney are getting along. And so if I'm Smith and Carney, frankly, Smith is smart by putting this out there. But if I'm Carney, I'm not going to let that opportunity slide. Like, I am going to take advantage of that. I'm going to use that as a way to say that I am different than there's a new sheriff in town. Canada needs this. And symbolically support it. So that's what I'd like to say about that, but happy to answer any questions if you have.
You know what? I don't at this time. I think if they build it, well, Alberta and Saskatchewan will fill it. So I'm not super worried about that. I think the economic case is quite clear at this point. The more and more I see the world react to the technological advancement of the last 3 years, the more I am quite certain that the future is going to be much more energy dependent than we ever thought was going to be real this quickly. However, I want folks to start understanding that there's going to be a significant diversification of energy production. And uniquely, Alberta actually has the ability to be that. We can continue to be the Texas of Canada, in that we will be able to provide not just oil and gas. We are able to provide incredible advancements in solar deployment, in wind. It doesn't stop at what we pull out of the ground necessarily. We have a very long sunny season. We have incredible engineering talent. We have capital. We have a risk-taking mentality. Uniquely, Alberta is positioned to do incredibly well over the next 30 years. And it's not, I think if you were to ask me that 6 years ago, I don't know if I would have answered it the same way. But I feel that way now, more so than I did even 2 years ago. So it's exciting.
Cool.
Hopefully Carney can come to the table and do some things that perhaps we've grown accustomed to not getting done in Canada.
Carney, I have actually faith in Carney, but Carney is part of a government that has a lot of people that maybe are not on that page yet. So I think that Carney has strong leadership skills. Again, even though I lean more conservative, I will be congratulating Carney after watching the coverage today in the Oval Office, if he does well, if he's able to, use this major projects office. Like I want to see Canada succeed, and I'm happy to see people trying some different things to make that happen. So we onward. It's actually been crazy with the amount that's been happening in politics and markets lately. It's insane. It's just so much.
It's so exciting. I'm having more fun than I've ever had. So
it's the life of a showgirl, right, Joel?
On the way out, I'd love to get your review of the. I listened to a reel saying that I should never ask a Swiftie what they think of the most recent album. They should come to you in their expression of it. But I'm guessing you enjoyed it, so.
I enjoyed it. I posted about this on Instagram the other day too. The reason why I enjoyed it, because I enjoy people who are highly authentic. I mean, she's obviously so talented and a brilliant artist, but I think that we should be congratulating people for being authentic. She is definitely in her don't give an F era where she is just, she's not being apologetic about her wealth, about her success, about her relationship. I think that's fantastic from a female empowerment perspective, but also just you do you, Taylor. You deserve this. You have earned this.
Well, it's unlikely that I'll listen to any of it. However, I am always cheering for her because I think that she's an incredible role model, and I want her to be successful.
Yes, likewise. Okay, well, next time we chat is going to be after the municipal elections in Alberta, so we'll have much to discuss there, and you'll be back in Canada, and hopefully this.
Do you got a prediction?
A little bit.
You got any predictions?
No, actually, I have no idea. Honestly, there's too many people running to be able to say how things are going to go.
I got no idea. I haven't been close enough to it municipally. I intend on getting a little bit more integrated when I get back, so we'll see. Cool. All right, Mel, thank you so much for your time.
Travels. Bye, Joel.
Bye.
That's all for today. Thanks for listening. If you found this valuable, please subscribe and share it with a friend. As always, the information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial and/or tax advice. Please consult a licensed professional for your own personal situation. Joel is a registered portfolio manager and investment advisor, and clients of his and his firm may own securities discussed on this podcast.